lined up, so that's really great. So a very warm welcome to all of you. Great to see you here. This is actually the fourth cycle of the CHERN Online Series. So CHERN, China and Europe Research Network, a platform for knowledge exchange and networking and pooling of research on China's engagements with Europe. We try to engage both academics and non-academics. And we have launched this online series during the lockdown period, of course, but we are continuing it because it really offers a nice way to reach out to many people and get great topics and research discussed and disseminated. And today the topic is the China factor in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, implications for EU-China relations. We thought it pertinent to actually discuss this topic within CHERN because since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, EU-China relations have arguably moved into a new phase, or we may see it in a different light. And there are many questions regarding China's positions and its relations with both Russia and the West and Europe. And we have three speakers that have been working on this topic and publishing on this topic. So we are really grateful that they can actually join us today. We will each give them the floor for about 10 minutes to present their work and thoughts on the China factor in this conflict. And then we really would like to have an open discussion with all participants. So we really encourage all of you to actively participate. I will first introduce the speakers. And then I will give them each the floor consecutively. The first speaker is Dr. Una Aleksandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova. I'm almost sure I don't pronounce that right, but maybe a little. She's head of Riga Stradins University's China Studies Center. She's also head of the Asia program of the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. And she has just published a book called The Perfect Imbalance, China and Russia. So she is very well positioned to speak about the relation between these two major powers, and we're really happy to have her here. The second speaker is Miguel Otero-Iglesias. He's a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute and a professor at the IE School of Global and Public Affairs in Madrid. He has just published a paper on the conflict, and the paper is called "Can the Russian Economy Withstand the Sanctions?" And here he also discusses the role of China in the sanctions regime against Russia. So he will maybe take us in a little bit of a different domain, but again, very pertinent to discuss this topic with us. And by the way, the links to these papers are also on the website, so maybe you've already read them, but otherwise you're encouraged to do so and invited to do so. And the third speaker is Tim Rühlig. He's a research fellow at the German Council of Foreign Relations, and he's also the leader of the CHERN working group on high tech and innovation. And he has also just published a paper on the conflict. It's called The China Factor in Russia's War, with the German Council of Foreign Relations, in which he sketches 5 different scenarios of what could happen with China in this conflict. And he'll talk about those scenarios and also the implications for EU-China relations. So this is a really great lineup of speakers. I'm very much looking forward to hearing their contributions and also to the discussion. I will be mostly silent, but I'll try to then moderate the discussion as good as possible. I suggest you can always put questions in the chat as they appear in your heads, so that we can refer to them in the discussion. And later you're also invited to open your camera, to open your mic and just pose your question yourself, but I will then ask you to do so when we're there. Okay, one final practical remark. We are recording the first part of this session, and then we'll stop the recording so that we can have an open and secure, safe debate. Yes, that's it. I'm looking at Aleksandra here. Aleksandra Bērziņa, our managing director of CHERN as the grant holder manager, and she's always taking care of technical assistance for these events, for which we are entirely and eternally grateful. So is there anything I should have said more, Aleksandra? No? Okay. With that concluded, then I give the floor first to Una, and looking forward to the talk.
Thank you, Nana, and thank you, dear colleagues. It's great to be here. Great to see everyone. So today's event has two future-oriented questions. The first one is how can we, well, sort of a present and future-oriented, how can we explain China's stance on Russia? And the second was regarding the strategic implications for Europe and EU-China relations. So maybe I will tackle the first part. You are right. I just published a book, and of course I was very scared that some things would be dated. At the same time, my overall argument that these two partners are not getting as cozy as we sometimes think they are, I think it still stands. Maybe it's something that I'm telling myself. So I posture that the partnership without limits is not without limits. That regardless of the narratives that both sides display and throw across the border, there is still a lot of there's still a lot of distrust, and it's growing. And these narratives, interestingly, are not rooted in reality. But today, actually, I don't want to talk about my book. I want to talk about Tim Rühlig's book. That also came out very recently, and it's called China's Foreign Policy Contradictions. It was published by Oxford University Press. And I think that maybe it's some sort of an exercise that's maybe too far out there. I think that we can apply some of Tim's measure and argue that through the Chinese narrative approach to Russia's war in Ukraine, we can shine a light at a particular foreign policy contradiction of China that Tim speaks of in his book, that over R2P and its application, the right to protect. Now, let me tell you what I mean. Tim's analysis has a chapter where he looks at how China approached Syria and Libya differently, and in terms of R2P argument, and how that in itself demonstrates a contradiction in China's foreign policy. I argue that China's narrative approach to Russia's war in Ukraine presents the same paradox, but within a single case. So rather than two separate countries, it's the same case. But of course, I mean, we have to be clear from the offset that R2P in the understanding of UN, and also in Tim's understanding, how he puts it, or indeed by any other measure, have nothing to do with Russia's invasion and the war in Ukraine. But interestingly, it is this exact argument that Russia keeps using in its Stratcom, and to which China, to some extent, contradictionally, as I argue, lends a shoulder in the public space. Let me give you a bit of an out, and then after that, I want to use that to outline how do we call China's stance on Russia? How can we explain? And I argue we can call it home before dark approach. So this is not a neutral approach. This is not a war approach, but this is kind of getting home before dark, not to be caught in the Russian worldview approach. So a bit of a background. The Russian Stratcom variety of UN's R2P is something we all heard. For example, when Putin spoke about why, when he announced the war on Ukraine at dawn on February 24th, he said, "It is necessary to immediately stop this nightmare, the genocide against the millions of people living there who rely on Russia only on us." But of course, this claim has been refuted. The OSCE report on the civilian deaths in the conflict-affected regions have concluded that the main cause of civilian deaths were when civilians have found ammunition and detonate them while mishandling them. But still, this argument, and Lavrov, of course, Lavrov uses it again, this time in the UN. He's trying to tie tie this argument and present it to the UN and almost say, that was at the Human Rights Council's 49th session, say, you guys aren't doing anything. This is a right to protect situation. And yet nobody supports us. Nobody supports Russia. It's always you against us. And he's blaming the UN. So here's what Lavrov says on March 1st. So already ongoing war. In the face of gross violation of the rights of Russian and Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, an 8-year war against them that bears every sign of genocide, the stubborn refusal of the West to get the Ukrainian authorities to fall in line, in the absence of any response from UN human rights bodies, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, Russia could not remain indifferent. So Russia is really laying it thick with the R2P argument that beats sovereignty. Even a month later, this communication is still front and center in the Russian outward-looking Stratcom. But the question is, how deep is this logic and has it taken root in the Chinese information space? For example, Jordan Heim writes in his article where he breaks down this phenomenon. The article is called "China Adopts Russia's Denazification Myth to Rationalize Invasion of Ukraine." On one hand, we see that the story about Ukrainian neo-Nazism and this implied R2P argument is missing from Chinese official statements. It's not there. We don't see spokespeople saying we need to protect the people against genocide, or that the fact that indeed there are neo-Nazis roaming Ukraine. We don't see that, right? We see the other argument. We see the argument that NATO's gotten too close to Russia's borders, that the US is pushing Russia. That's why it's justified. But that's the second part of Russia's Stratcom, but not the neo-Nazi story. And yet, on the other hand, the Russian R2P rationale is not missing from the Chinese social media and official media space. Because when reporting on the war in Ukraine, or the Wukalan Jushu, right, the situation as it is used in the Chinese discourse, including via the Russian propaganda story, it has this angle that Ukrainian neo-Nazis, for example, quote unquote, opened fire on Chinese students. So not directly speaking about the fact that there are neo-Nazis who are conducting these, atrocities as Putin puts them, so Russia has the right to attack, but rather the fact that it concerns us as well, the Chinese. So China is trying to use this. And there was another interesting angle that Chinese official media took in another report on the denazification story, namely the fact that it was again the Americans' fault because the Americans had trained the Azov battalions who were the neo-Nazis. So China takes a very interesting approach to this argument. It doesn't let it seep into the higher levels of communications of state officials, unlike other Russian arguments. At the same time, it is existent on lower levels, on levels of media discourse, and it takes two very interesting shapes. First of all, what does it mean for Chinese citizens? And secondly, it's the US's fault again. Even the fact that neo-Nazis exist in Ukraine is because they were trained by the US. Of course, this immediately causes flashbacks in the comments section on how the US trained the Al-Qaeda and all that. So yeah, they do that, we know. And I find that extremely interesting because that is contradictory. That is very contradictory. Either sovereignty, either China backs sovereignty argument as it does when it communicates, when the Chinese officials communicate with the Ukrainian counterparts, with Dmytro Kuleba saying that China respects sovereignty, or China backs this R2P, well, hijacked R2P logic of Putin. Which way is it? I believe that Chinese approach, and I think we can discuss more because this is an unfinished thought in a sense. It's an article I'm working on for a strategic communications journal. But I think this Chinese approach, of course, it is something that is not an implicit backing of Russia via non-action, but rather it is this ambiguity, or China helping to solve the crisis, quote unquote, in its own way, falling back that Tim Rühlig. So conflicting narratives, China tries to reach two arguably opposite goals. The first goal, to use the war in Ukraine as an argument, of course, as we all know, to demonstrate that the West, specifically the US, has a detrimental effect on global security. And Russia's actions are a consequence of being pushed to the wall when, quote unquote, US drove 5 waves of NATO expansion eastward all the way to Russia's doorstep. We all read that statement. China attacks the US as the culprit and the leading instigator of the Ukraine crisis. And of course, that serves China's own agenda in its vicinity. And that is why the R2P argument is not there in the higher level of communication, because it just doesn't serve this anti-US agenda. But at the same time, and as I've interviewed, also I've ran this by a couple of colleagues in Chinese academia and kind of bounced ideas off of each other. And I don't know if you buy this or if I buy this, but I'm just putting this out there. There's an opinion that perhaps the idea that sheer proximity of the US security architecture to Russia's borders warrants war is a non sequitur, even by China's measure. So yes, you have this issue, you have these challengers, but attacking that does not kind of, that's a leap, right? So maybe there needs to be some sort of a link to explain why now, why like this. And this low-key claim that the Ukrainian side has been conducting genocide, it serves this purpose, but you cannot let it go too high, because then that would challenge the sovereignty above all argument. So you cannot China would use the genocide argument, the R2P argument, to bridge this gap, but at the same time, over amplifying it could lead it down this, slippery slope of admitting something, quote unquote, human rights-y, that it could beat state sovereignty. So the solution is China's state media comfortable with repeating the Russian story about neo-Nazis and the need to protect the threatened populations. But nothing like that in the official statements. And also Igor Denisov has written about it, that despite the increased proximity between the Chinese and Russian narrative positions, China has made no pronouncements on Russia's desire to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Officially, China is silent on this angle of Russian Stratcom. I wonder what you have to say about this. But now to finish off with this, why do I call this, and why do I think it's a home before dark approach? Because China is not neutral. It has not taken any middle ground. It is venturing out of the middle ground in terms of strategic communications very deeply into the Russian camp. And we do see rhetoric support to Russia, sticking with the reading that, about so letting the story of Russia's R2P argument seep into the information space. But China also makes sure to come home before nightfall every time. It takes measures not to be permanently discursively tied to Russia's story, strategically signaling, as we saw during the April Fool's Summit, this is not our war, talking about sovereignty and territorial integrity during conversations with Ukrainian counterparts. So what does that mean for the future, and how long will China hide in the safety of this ambiguous home before dark approach to Russia's war in Ukraine? Is hard to tell. But of course, as the West is pushing, especially the US is pushing China to take a stance, and it's either you're with us or against us, I think there's going to be a shift. But I just think it's an interesting demonstration of how Chinese foreign policy contradictions can be found not in different cases, not in. Thank you. And sorry if I blabbled too much because I have a fever, as I told my colleagues already. So sorry if it's a little bit unorganized.
Well, you were incredibly sharp for having a fever. Thank you. There is no lab, but there is sometimes a little bit with the sound. So that's just the internet. But we got it all right, I think, or maybe it's me because the internet here is also a little bit unstable. But thanks. This was really an excellent expose of the one of the contradictions of Chinese foreign policy applied to this case, and I look forward to continue on that. But not after having heard the other two speakers first, as promised. And I suggest we continue with Miguel. So I give you the floor, Miguel, and then around 10 minutes for your contribution.
Well, wonderful. Thanks, Nana. Thanks, Tim, for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let's follow the metaphor of Una, home before dawn. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, how can I apply it to my analytical framework? And I guess I would have to say that at least in the economic side of things, I would rather say that it is out in the dark, right? Going out in when the dark comes in, that people don't see what you're doing, right? So better, so you have one China that is in the day lights and portrays one view or one action, one behavior, and the other that is a bit less under the spotlight. And so my argument is, and it's a bit, it's a bit controversial. And when you work in a think tank, sometimes you have to be a bit more controversial, but that perhaps a bit of a reference point could be China's policy to North Korea, right? So vis-a-vis the world, you say, look, we need to sanction, or we accept the sanctions, although we think they are stupid, and you kind of follow the West on saying, yeah, perhaps they have a certain, or you don't go against them, let's say, but then what you don't want is for the North Korean regime, and in this case, what China doesn't want is for the Russian regime to and the Russian economy to collapse. And so China will not openly support militarily or even economically Russia. And it's kind of funny because before the war, like a few months before the war, Bobolo from the Vrije Institute, he was like, giving a lot of talks about the China-Russia relationship. And he was like saying, look, they remain partners, if not allies. But what they will not do is really go into some sort of armed conflict for the other, right? And so I think China is in that position where they would certainly not take a stand militarily in favor of Russia. On the economic side of things that I'm more interested in, there were a few things that are interesting, right? One is that this hypothesis that the Chinese knew about the invasion or not was to be debated, right? And that they said, look, let's do this after the Olympics. We don't know. What we know is that the day or the day after of the invasion, they lifted their restrictions on the imports of Russian wheat and barley, right? That were restricted because of phytosanitary reasons. And that particular 24 hours later, one day later, they were lifted so that Russia, as you know, a big export of wheat could export its wheat to China. What we know as well is that exports and imports of China, especially kind of exports from China to Russia, increased enormously in the months before the war. What we know as well is that in March, so after the invasion started, the export increased as well 12%, which so continues a pattern of increased exports to Russia. And so we have then certain signals that China has sent in terms of being cautious, of being seen as circumventing the sanctions or undermining the sanctions, if you want. It seems that a lot of the Chinese banks are not really operating and not really kind of transacting. And so then that tells you, okay, how this is done. And here we can then see whether the banks are not sanctions by Russia, they're still operating, so you can still use them, and China can still use them, right? You can still use a lot of yuan, and it seems that China has been importing Russian commodities in yuan since March, okay, increasingly. We have certainly the understanding that in two particular sectors, China might see a big opportunity, or is seeing a big opportunity. Those sectors are telecommunications. And by the way, one of the key aspects in the Fortress Russia strategy, in terms of building trust of the Russian citizens vis-a-vis the Russian financial system, was to have a national payment system for cards even issued by Visa and MasterCard, etc., that they would operate in this national payment system called MIR, that was introduced after the Crimea sanctions in 2014-15. A lot of the equipment that is used for the MIR is Huawei equipment, okay? 40% of all the cell phones in Russia before the war were Chinese. That might increase. And I'm not going to delve too much into that because I'm sure Tim, perhaps, on the technology front, he might, on chips, etc. But my view is that China, look, the more this drags on, and unfortunately, I just don't see any player in this war wanting to finish the war soon. The Russians certainly not, because they believe they need to conquer whatever they think is necessary to present this as a victory. The Ukrainians, obviously, they will not stop, because if not, they will give up a big chunk of their territory. The Americans are very keen on arming the Ukrainians as much as possible to see Putin losing this war. And the Chinese have no interest in stopping this war, because at the end of the day, the longer this war goes, the more the United States is focused on that particular battlefield, the more as well the Europeans are worried about their circumstances and talk less about Xinjiang and a lot of other things of human rights in China that were, in the news a lot of time, before the war. Now suddenly, what happened to Xinjiang? Now it's forgotten. No one talks about Xinjiang. And the more it drags on, Russia is more vulnerable and more in need of Chinese support, right? And for China's strategy, this is an important factor. And the other sector is, of course, automobiles, right? If the Germans withdraw from Russia, the Chinese, Russia is already the third biggest market for Chinese cars, it will all increase. Right? This is still a very important market of 140 million people, where the Chinese, I read some of the Chinese auto industry commentators that this is an opportunity in a history. In the century. It's a once in a time century of opportunity to penetrate even further the Russian market. And so, all what I wanted to say is that, look, there are signals that are clear to say, look, we will not undermine your sanctions in speech and in action. I think, some of the banks have signaled that. I think some of the purchase of oil goes in that direction. But then on the other hand, a lot of gas and liquefied gas and all the Chinese investment in the Arctic, that's vested interest will only continue. A lot of Chinese technology after Crimea went into that, and that will continue. And we will see what happens with Siberia too, etc. But the view is, look, Russia will send us their energy, and signals like UnionPay, right? Which UnionPay said, look, we're not gonna work with the Russian banks and use our technology to go out and providing their citizens with our payment system, etc. So there are certain key signals where a lot of Western commentators say, look, China remains cautious, and obviously will remain cautious because the US and the European Union market are much more important for China than the Russian one. China doesn't want to be isolated. But what is true as well, and it goes a bit to the EU-China relations, talking with senior officials from Europe, they state me clearly. I mean, they are worried about two things. One, that they feel that they are alone, that the West is alone. The majority of countries in this world are not following the sanctions. I think the Economist had a piece yesterday or so talking about, look, the majority of countries, they are on the fence. And a lot of them, they believe there's a lot of hypocrisy in the West about this war, if you compare it with the Iraq war. And so that worries them, because now in a lot of meetings of senior European officials, what they get is that you are, through the sanctions, making my life more difficult by higher wheat prices, by higher commodity prices, and that's problematic. And second, from a European point of view, we cannot afford to have another battleground with China. We have already, our hands full with Russia and what Russia will mean, and especially if Russia closes our taps and we don't have energy, and how prices will go up. Even in countries like mine, where we don't depend whatsoever on Russian energy, there was a transport strike 2-3 weeks ago that left our supermarkets half empty. No one wants to go there. So a lot of countries hiding behind Germany, although Germany gets all the stick. And so we cannot really afford right now to open a battlefront with China and starting to sanction China in case China will undermine our sanctions. I leave it here. Sorry for going for 12 minutes, Nana. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you so much. And yes, that was an intriguing question about that there's no player that wants to end the war soon, except then maybe Europe, or at least the EU. But that's for later. Thanks a lot. Great contribution as well. I move to Tim Rühlig, and then I'm sure we have lots to digest and discuss.
Thank you so much. So before I make my points, I learned that maybe I should have Una to present my book instead of myself. So Una, you booked for a book launched tour through Europe now, and I'll see whether I can present your book. Maybe that's a good way to do it. So yeah. And I also think that it was very interesting, of course, listening to both of you. Sometimes it's really cool to have a controversial discussion, and I think particularly some of the points Miguel makes may contradict a bit my views, so that may help us have a lively discussion. So I'd like to make 4 points here. The first is, and they will address 4 questions. The first is, what are sort of the premises of China's reaction to the Russia war? I believe there are a few. If we want to, that to me is sort of fundamental to sort of understand how can we analyze what China is doing. The first is, I think, that the length and intensity of the war does shape opportunities as well as risks for China. And that's why I think we need to consider several scenarios. Other than Nana has said, I will not run through all the 5 scenarios, at least not in my initial presentation, because then I would just use so much time to detail the scenarios itself and sort of run wood from different angles is sort of the point. Also, I saw that the link to the paper is already in the chat. So I'll try to rather sort of take something out of those scenarios on sort of a more general level. And if you're then interested, we can either discuss it in the Q&A, or you just go back to the paper and sort of see the 5 scenarios that I've put up there. I also think that China is fundamentally inclined to support Russia. And for that, reasons will follow on my the second question I'm going to address. And third, I think sort of China behaves mostly reactively, cautiously and opportunistically to the developments. So I don't see China sort of shaping the current geopolitical situation. Yeah, I think it's really more on the reactive front, even though, of course, with very active interests and sort of trying to avoid risks that are coming up, and also seizing any opportunity that is obviously also there. So the second question I want to address is, what are China's interests in this situation? So how is it sort of assessing the opportunities and risks that are coming up? And I think essentially there are 2 to 3, depending on sort of how you structure them, 2 to 3 considerations from China's viewpoint. The first is geopolitics. That includes, of course, first and foremost, the situation with the competition, the power struggle with the United States, and how sort of how whatever development you're going to see in the coming weeks and months, hopefully just weeks, hopefully just days, but probably much longer, then what are sort of the implications for the geopolitical struggle, the power struggle with the United States? But it also includes Taiwan. And I think sort of if I want to sort of stop at the Taiwan issue for a second, I think you can draw sort of different conclusions from that. So I think if China hasn't decided yet how to go about Taiwan in the near future, then I think probably the rather unitary and strong response from the West may have decreased the risk of a military invasion of Taiwan. But if we consider that Xi Jinping maybe has already taken the decision that within his time in office, he will take Taiwan no matter what, and considering the situation in Taiwan, that he has already decided in favor of a military invasion of Taiwan, in that case, I think the time span in which we should expect such an invasion has probably rather shortened than lengthened due to what's happening in Russia. Because, I mean, we do see a trend of alarmment in the West. If Europe is to follow up on its promises, Germany, others, and invest more in its defense capabilities, then obviously that would free resources, military capabilities in the medium term for the United States that it could relocate to the Indo-Pacific. And in that case, I think China would find an even stronger resistance to its plans. And in that regard, I think it could very well be that the time span for an invasion to Taiwan lies somewhere between 3 to 6 years. Because I think China will try to push forward as long as possible a disentanglement, economic disentanglement approach, become more self-reliant, be less vulnerable. So that speaks in favor of waiting as long as possible. But also it takes around 5-6 years for Europe to get in a much stronger military position. So that would free then US capabilities to East Asia. So I think maybe a time frame of around 5 years. If Xi Jinping has already decided to invade Taiwan, that may happen in 5 years. So that's sort of the geopolitical angle. Then I also think that economic interests play into the equation here. Trade, energy, technology. I think on the energy front, of course, there's plenty of potential in the partnership with Russia, but on trade and technology, China simply relies so much more on the West. And the third factor, I think, is normative. So it's a question a bit of reputation. It's also a question of sort of are pro-democratic, pro-Western forces rather strengthened or weakened at the end of this war. And I do think sort of from those aspects, they're competing interests that point into different directions. But apparently, while in the first few days, it seemed that China hadn't made up its mind what of those aspects, geopolitics, economic interests, etc., sort of take premise. It seems that geopolitics is sort of the dominating factor at this point. Not sure it necessarily needs to stay that way, but for now, China seems to be willing to, in the end, also pay some form of economic price. Now, the third question I want to address is the question, what is China's preferred and what is its worst outcome? I can keep this very short because Miguel has already said something about this, I think. I think the best outcome for China is indeed what I would call in very close alignment with Miguel, a North Koreanization of Russia. And that is best achievable. And here is where we differ, where sort of we have a different perspective, I think, in a short war scenario. Because if Russia, if the war is relatively short, then but Russia remains isolated, then sort of potential risks for secondary effects, secondary sanctions on China remain limited. There's less pressure on Western democracies to also broaden the sanctions regime. But at the same time, Russia remains isolated, remains in the hands, turns into sort of a junior partner in the geopolitical struggle with the United States to the Chinese. The worst case scenario, obviously, is the fall of the Putin regime and any risks, including geopolitical realignment of Russia, potentially even with the West. That, of course, would be, I think, a horror scenario from Beijing's point of view. There's many ifs and whens involved in such a scenario, but I think that Beijing, if it's good in anything, then considering all options, all the worst case scenarios possible, and sort of factor them into their calculations. So I do think that length of the conflict matters because it could increase pressure for secondary sanctions, secondary effects on China. And yeah, in that front, I'm more optimistic than Miguel. I do think that the Chinese have an interest in seeing this war end at some point. It's just, I don't think that this is sort of their primary goal, but I don't see an active interest from China's side of having a long war. And fourth and finally, the last question I want to address here. I'm also working in a think tank, so a question that is put forward to us thinking this is always, what shall we do? So the Europeans. I'll be very brief on that. I have 7 recommendations in the paper, but I'll just sort of sum them into 3 points. The first is, I think we need to, and that's maybe the most important, sort of find a right balance between managing long-term disentanglement. I do think that sort of what we see at the moment is accelerating existing trends of this economic disentanglement, but also sort of keep so reduce vulnerabilities, reduce dependencies. Miguel is right that we can't have it all at once. We can't sort of reduce energy dependencies on Russia and tech dependencies and trade dependencies on China, etc. But sort of, but I do think that this war has made very clear that this is a lot what we should be thinking about. But also, I think we need to keep sort of an engagement because, I mean, the North Koreanization of Russia, I think, is quite, a horror scenario for us. I mean, it is true that from a moral viewpoint, it's of course very difficult to advocate now deeper economic and technological ties with Russia. But at the same time, a Russia that falls entirely into China's hands is also not in our best interest. And the same, I think, goes for China. So yes, reducing vulnerabilities, but also keeping up some form of engagement. Otherwise, sort of conflict becomes less and less costly. So the old understanding that interdependence has some value sort of beyond the economic output itself, I think still stands. So, and finding the right balance and the right mix from both sides, because China has the exact same considerations, I think is something we really carefully need to consider. The second, and I promise I'll be much briefer on my last 2 points, is learn for Taiwan. I think we need to invest in our defense. We can draw, I think, some conclusions from the Ukrainian situation. For Taiwan, I do think that sort of freeing resources for the Indo-Pacific, I don't see sort of Europe being a major security actor in the Indo-Pacific, but sort of managing our own security, getting there in the medium term, that we can defend ourselves better, is not least in an interest, because we may have a return of Trump in 2 years, or a Trump type of president in the United States. I think it does put pressure on us, but it will also free resources for the Indo-Pacific. And finally, I think strengthening democratic alliances. I mean, I don't think it is any useful to sort of to put ideology at the center or discourse at the moment. But I do think that sort of the rift along systemic lines, autocracies versus democracies, is present, whether we emphasize it or not, whether we sort of focus on that distinction or not. Doesn't matter that much. I think it's just there. It is very obvious. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. So lots of new thesis propositions on the table. We will now close the formal round and also stop recording, and we open up